Corporal Friedrich Keller stood in line at Camp Gordon, Georgia, staring at the small wooden box a guard had just placed in his hands. Inside lay a toothbrush, a bar of soap, a razor, and a tube of something labeled toothpaste. He turned to his fellow prisoner, Hans Vogel, and both men started laughing, not from joy but from sheer disbelief. These were the same Americans they'd been told were brutal savages, yet here they were handing out toiletries like Christmas presents. Friedrich had watched good men die from infected wounds and dysentery in North Africa, had seen his own Wehrmacht officers hoard medical supplies while soldiers' teeth rotted in their skulls. Now his captors were enforcing mandatory dental checkups. Something about this war suddenly felt very, very different, and as he clutched that simple toothbrush, Friedrich began to wonder if everything he'd been told about the enemy was a carefully constructed lie. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The transport ship that brought Friedrich Keller to America in late 1944 had been nothing like he expected. He had prepared himself for beatings, starvation, maybe even execution. The propaganda films shown to Wehrmacht troops depicted American soldiers as bloodthirsty gangsters who showed no mercy to prisoners. Instead, when Friedrich and 200 other captured German soldiers boarded the vessel in North Africa, they received blankets, hot soup, and instructions in passable German about sanitation procedures. The contrast was so stark that Friedrich wondered if this was some elaborate psychological trick, a way to lower their guard before the real horrors began. Friedrich was 26 years old, though he felt decades older. He had joined the Wehrmacht in 1939, swept up in the fervor that consumed his small Bavarian village. His father had fought in the Great War and came home with stories of honor and brotherhood. Friedrich wanted that same glory, that same sense of purpose. Instead, he got North Africa, where the sun baked men into husks and supply lines, stretched so thin that soldiers went days without proper food. He got Russia, where winter killed more men than bullets ever could. He got the slow, grinding realization that this war was not about honor at all, but about something far darker that he didn't fully understand. The ship journey took 3 weeks, and during that time, Friedrich witnessed something that shook his worldview. A young German private named Klaus Weber developed a severe fever, his body burning up as infection spread from a wound he'd received before capture. Friedrich expected the Americans to let Klaus die or throw him overboard. Instead, a U.S. Navy medic named Rodriguez spent hours treating Klaus, administering precious sulfa drugs and changing his bandages with a gentleness that made Friedrich's throat tight. Rodriguez spoke to Klaus in broken German, telling him he'd be fine, that they'd take care of him. Klaus survived, and when he finally sat up, weak but recovering, he looked at Friedrich with tears streaming down his face and whispered that he didn't understand anything anymore. Neither did Friedrich. His understanding of the world had been built on a foundation of certainties, us versus them, good versus evil, the righteousness of the cause he'd been fighting for. But watching Rodriguez save Klaus's life with the same care he'd give one of his own countrymen planted a seed of doubt that grew with each passing day. Friedrich began to notice other things. The American guards were young, many of them looking barely old enough to shave. They joked with each other, complained about their own officers, shared cigarettes during breaks. They looked like the boys from his village, just wearing different uniforms. When the ship finally docked in Norfolk, Virginia, Friedrich got his first glimpse of America. The port was massive, filled with ships and cranes and trucks moving in organized chaos. There were no bombed-out buildings, no rubble-filled streets, no hollow-eyed civilians picking through ruins. Everything looked intact, functioning almost absurdly normal. Women in colorful dresses walked alongside men in suits. Children played near the docks under the watchful eyes of their mothers. It was like stepping into a different universe, one where war was something that happened far away to other people. From Norfolk, Friedrich and his group were loaded onto trains headed south. The train cars were old but clean, with actual seats instead of just bare floors. Guards distributed sandwiches, thick slices of bread with meat and cheese that Friedrich devoured in seconds. He couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten real meat. In the Afrika Korps, Rations had dwindled to hardtack and whatever they could scavenge. In the final months before his capture, Friedrich had been surviving on watery soup and moldy bread. The sandwich tasted like a feast. The journey through the American South mesmerized Friedrich. He pressed his face against the train window, watching endless forests give way to farmland, small towns, and eventually the red clay earth of Georgia. Everything looked so untouched, so abundant. Farms stretched for miles, heavy with crops. Cattle grazed in green pastures. The wealth was staggering, incomprehensible. How could Germany ever have thought it could win a war against a nation with such resources? Camp Gordon sat outside Augusta, Georgia, a sprawling complex of barracks surrounded by wire fences and watchtowers. When the train pulled into the camp's railway siding, Friedrich and the other prisoners were ordered to disembark and line up for processing. This was the moment Friedrich had been dreading, when the facade would drop and the real treatment would begin. He stood at attention, shoulders back, preparing himself for whatever came next. Instead, an American sergeant with a thick Southern accent read through a list of rules in halting German. No escape attempts, follow orders, respect the guards. Work assignments would be given based on skills and experience. Letters home would be permitted once per month. Medical care would be provided. And then came the part that made Friedrich's jaw drop. Each prisoner would receive a hygiene kit and be expected to maintain personal cleanliness. Daily showers were mandatory. Dental inspections would occur monthly. Friedrich thought he'd misunderstood. He turned to Hans Vogel, who looked equally baffled. Hans, a former factory worker from Hamburg, whispered, "Did he just say we have to shower every day?" Friedrich nodded slowly, still processing. In the Wehrmacht, soldiers went weeks without proper washing. Water was too precious, too scarce. Officers might have the luxury of staying clean, but regular soldiers learned to live with dirt and lice and the constant itch of unwashed skin. The processing line moved forward, and Friedrich found himself standing in front of a table where a bored-looking corporal handed him a wooden box. Friedrich opened it and stared at the contents with that same disbelieving laughter he'd share with Hans. The toothbrush was made of actual wood and bristles, not the stripped twigs soldiers sometimes used in the field. The soap smelled like something floral, almost pleasant. The razor was sharp and new. The tube of toothpaste proclaimed in English lettering that it would give him a bright smile. "You've got to be kidding," Hans muttered beside him, holding up his own toothbrush like it was an alien artifact. "They're actually giving us toothbrushes." Friedrich couldn't stop laughing. It was absurd. It was insane. He had fought for 3 years in a brutal war, had seen men die in countless horrible ways, had been captured and shipped across an ocean to enemy territory, and now his captors were concerned about his dental hygiene. The disconnect was so enormous that his mind struggled to process it. The barracks they were assigned to was basic but clean, with rows of metal bunks and thin mattresses. After the trenches and foxholes Friedrich had called home for months, it looked like a palace. Each prisoner was given 2 sets of clothing marked with a large PW on the back, 1 blanket, 1 pillow, and instructions to store their hygiene kits in the footlocker at the end of their bunk. A guard explained in broken German that hot water for showers would be available between 6 and 8 in the evening. Attendance was mandatory. That first night, Friedrich stood under a stream of hot water and felt something inside him crack. He had not been properly clean in over a year. The water was almost too hot, turning his pale skin pink, but he didn't care. He scrubbed at the layers of grime and sweat and shame, watching the dirt spiral down the drain. Around him, other German prisoners were doing the same, some crying openly, others standing in stunned silence. Hans stood in the next shower stall, his face tilted up to the spray, eyes closed. When Friedrich caught his gaze, Hans just shook his head, unable to put words to what they were experiencing. The days at Camp Gordon fell into a routine that Friedrich found both comforting and deeply unsettling. Réveillé at 6 in the morning, followed by breakfast in a mess hall that served portions larger than Friedrich had eaten in months. Oatmeal with real sugar, toast with butter, powdered eggs that tasted like heaven compared to field rations, coffee, actual hot coffee, as much as you wanted. Friedrich gained 15 pounds in the first month, his hollow cheeks filling out, his ribs becoming less prominent. Work assignments came next. Friedrich, who had worked in his father's carpentry shop before the war, was assigned to a wood shop where prisoners built furniture and repaired equipment for the camp. The workshop was well lit, properly ventilated, with good tools that were kept in excellent condition. An American sergeant named Patterson supervised, an older man with a limp from the First World War who treated the German workers with gruff fairness. Patterson didn't speak German, and Friedrich's English was limited, but they communicated through gestures and shared understanding of the craft. The work was honest labor, the kind Friedrich had done as a teenager. There was satisfaction in planning a board smooth, in cutting joints that fit perfectly, in seeing a project come together through skill and patience. It was so far removed from the violence and chaos of combat that Friedrich sometimes forgot he was a prisoner of war. He was just a carpenter again, making things instead of breaking them. The dental inspection came at the end of Friedrich's second week. Prisoners lined up outside the camp infirmary, where a U.S. Army dentist named Captain Morris examined each man's teeth with professional thoroughness. When Friedrich's turn came, he sat in the chair and opened his mouth, expecting a quick glance and dismissal. Instead, Captain Morris spent several minutes checking each tooth, making notes, asking questions through an interpreter about pain or sensitivity. "You've got 2 cavities that need filling," Captain Morris said in English, which the interpreter translated. "And your gums are showing signs of scurvy, probably from poor nutrition. We'll get those cavities taken care of next week, and I want you eating more fresh vegetables. The mess sergeant will be informed." Friedrich stared at the dentist. "You're going to fix my teeth?" Captain Morris looked at him like the question was strange. "Of course. Untreated cavities lead to infections, and infections can kill you." "Can't have that." He made another note on his clipboard. "You should be brushing at least twice a day. Are you using the toothpaste we issued?" "Yes," Friedrich managed, still stunned. "Good. Keep it up." Captain Morris patted his shoulder. "You're doing fine. Next." The cavity fillings happened exactly as promised. Friedrich returned to the infirmary the following week, where Captain Morris numbed his mouth with Novocaine and drilled out the decay with steady hands. The procedure was uncomfortable but not unbearable, and when it was done, Friedrich ran his tongue over the smooth fillings and felt an emotion he couldn't quite name. The Wehrmacht had dentists, but they were reserved for officers. Regular soldiers with bad teeth either lived with the pain or had them pulled. Friedrich had watched men suffer for months with abscessed teeth, their faces swollen and fevered, until finally a field medic yanked the offending tooth with pliers and no anesthetic. Here, the enemy had fixed his teeth, had taken the time and resources to repair minor damage in the mouth of a captured soldier who might never be of any use to them. Friedrich thought about this constantly, turning it over in his mind like a puzzle he couldn't solve. What kind of nation fought a war this way? What kind of system allowed for such treatment of prisoners? The answer started to become clear through small observations and conversations. Friedrich's English improved gradually through interaction with guards and through an English class offered in the camp's recreation hall. He learned that America had signed something called the Geneva Conventions, international agreements about the treatment of prisoners of war. The hygiene requirements, the medical care, the adequate food, all of it was mandated by these agreements. America was following rules, even in war. But it was more than just following rules. Friedrich saw something else in the way the American guards conducted themselves. There was a casualness to their authority, a lack of the rigid hierarchy he'd known in the Wehrmacht. Guards joked with prisoners, shared stories, sometimes even asked about Germany and what life had been like before the war. A young private named Davies from somewhere called Tennessee often stopped by the workshop to chat with Friedrich, practicing his German while Friedrich practiced English. "My grandfather came from Germany," Davies told him one afternoon, leaning against a workbench while Friedrich sanded a chair leg. "Little town called Heidelberg. Ever been there?" "Once," Friedrich replied, searching for English words. "Very beautiful. Old castle." "Yeah, that's what my granddad said. He came over in 1905, worked on a farm in Tennessee till he saved enough to buy his own place." Davies shook his head. "Always talked about going back to visit, but then the war came and, well, that got complicated." Friedrich paused his sanding. "Your family is German?" "On my dad's side, yeah. Mom's people are Irish." Davies grinned. "I'm what they call a mutt. Little bit of everything." The concept fascinated Friedrich. In Germany, bloodlines and heritage were treated as sacred, unchangeable markers of identity. Here was an American soldier with German blood who saw it as just one thread in a larger tapestry. Davies didn't seem conflicted about fighting against the land of his ancestors. It was simply what needed to be done. Hans Vogel, who had been assigned to the camp kitchen, brought different observations. "The Negro soldiers eat in a separate mess hall," he told Friedrich one evening as they sat outside their barracks, enjoying the warm Georgia twilight. "Did you notice that? They're not allowed to mix with the white soldiers." Friedrich had noticed. The camp had colored troops who handled support duties, and they lived in separate barracks on the far side of the compound. He'd seen them marching in formation, working in the motor pool, standing guard, but always apart from the white soldiers. It confused him. These were Americans fighting for America, yet they were segregated from their own countrymen. "I asked Davies about it," Hans continued, lighting a cigarette he'd gotten from a guard in exchange for kitchen work. "He looked uncomfortable and said that's just how things are in the South. But some of the northern soldiers, they don't seem to like it much. There's tension there." Friedrich thought about this. The propaganda had painted America as a unified monolith, but the reality was far more complex. There were divisions here, inequalities, problems that went beyond the war. Knowing this didn't make Friedrich feel superior. He'd seen enough of the horrors committed in Germany's name to abandon any sense of righteousness. Instead, it made him realize that every nation was flawed, every system had cracks, every group of people struggled with the same basic failures of treating each other decently. Summer arrived with oppressive heat and humidity that reminded Friedrich of North Africa, though at least here there was shade and plenty of water. Work in the shop slowed to match the weather, and prisoners spent their evenings in the recreation hall, where they could read books from a small library, play cards, or write letters home. Friedrich wrote to his mother every 2 weeks, carefully worded missives that passed through censors on both sides. He told her he was safe and healthy. He did not tell her about the toothbrush or the dental care or the hot showers because he knew she wouldn't believe him. He barely believed it himself. Letters from home took months to arrive and came irregularly. When Friedrich finally received a response from his mother, her words were guarded, but he could read between the lines. Things were bad in Germany. Food was scarce. Allied bombing had intensified. His hometown had been hit twice, and several buildings he remembered from childhood were now rubble. His mother was living with his aunt because their house had been damaged. She was glad he was safe, she said, and he shouldn't worry about them. They would manage. Friedrich read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in his footlocker. He felt a complicated mixture of guilt and relief. Guilt that he was safe and well-fed while his mother scrounged for food in a war-torn country. Relief that he was here instead of there, that he wouldn't have to participate in whatever desperate final actions the Reich might demand of its soldiers. The war news filtered into the camp through guards and through German-language newspapers that were distributed weekly. Friedrich learned about D-Day, about the Allied advance across France, about the Soviet push from the east. The news was presented factually, without the propaganda spin he'd grown accustomed to in Wehrmacht briefings. Maps showed the shrinking territory held by German forces. The trajectory was clear. Germany was losing, had probably already lost, and now it was just a matter of time until the final collapse. Some prisoners took this news hard. There were men in the camp who still believed in final victory, in secret weapons that would turn the tide, in the necessity of the war they'd been fighting. These men kept to themselves, forming small groups that Friedrich avoided. They looked at prisoners like Friedrich with contempt, called them defeatists and traitors for accepting their situation too readily. But most prisoners seemed to feel as Friedrich did, a numb acceptance of reality mixed with quiet gratitude for their circumstances. Hans put it best one night as they sat outside watching stars appear in the darkening sky. "We're the lucky ones," Hans said softly. "We got captured by the right side. Can you imagine if we'd been taken by the Russians? Or if we were Americans in German hands?" Friedrich had heard stories about the Eastern Front, about what happened to prisoners on both sides. He'd also heard whispers about camps in Germany itself, special camps where certain categories of people were sent. The whispers had always been accompanied by warnings not to ask questions, not to dig deeper, to focus on one's duty and ignore what happened outside one's direct sphere. Friedrich had followed those warnings at the time, telling himself it wasn't his business, that he was just a soldier following orders. Now, sitting in a prisoner of war camp where his captors gave him toothpaste and fixed his teeth, Friedrich was forced to confront what he'd chosen not to see. If America treated enemy prisoners with such care, what did that say about a system that treated human beings as disposable? What did that say about the cause he'd been fighting for? The autumn of 1944 brought cooler weather and news of continued Allied advances. Friedrich's work in the shop continued, and he developed a quiet friendship with Sergeant Patterson, who taught him English woodworking terms and occasionally shared stories about his own time in France during the Great War. Patterson had fought against Germans then, had killed men who might have been Friedrich's father or uncles, yet he bore no obvious hatred toward his current charges. "War's a nasty business," Patterson said one afternoon, watching Friedrich chisel a mortise joint. "You do what you have to do when you're in it, but that doesn't mean you have to carry hate around forever. You boys didn't start this war any more than I started the last one. We're all just caught up in something bigger than ourselves." Friedrich nodded, not trusting his English enough to respond adequately, but Patterson's words stayed with him. The Americans seemed to understand something that the ideology Friedrich had been raised in had obscured. War was a temporary condition, not a permanent state of being. Enemies could become something else once the shooting stopped. Christmas approached, and the camp administration organized a celebration. A large evergreen tree was erected in the compound center, decorated with handmade ornaments. The mess hall prepared a special meal, turkey with stuffing and vegetables, and even pie for dessert. Prisoners were encouraged to sing carols, and a chaplain offered services in German for those who wished to attend. Friedrich went to the service, not out of particular religious conviction, but because he wanted to hear his native language spoken in full sentences, without the halting translations and broken grammar that characterized most communication. The chaplain was a German-American pastor from Wisconsin who had volunteered for the Army. He spoke about peace and reconciliation, about the true meaning of Christmas being hope in darkness, love in the midst of hate. "This war will end," the chaplain said, his voice carrying through the makeshift chapel. "And when it does, you will go home to rebuild. You will have a choice then about what kind of men you want to be, what kind of nation you want Germany to become. The question you must ask yourselves is this: what have you learned from this experience? What will you carry forward?" Friedrich thought about his toothbrush, sitting in his footlocker alongside his other possessions. Such a small, mundane object, yet it represented something profound about the difference between systems, between philosophies of how to treat human beings. He thought about Captain Morris taking the time to fix his cavities, about the hot showers and adequate food, about Davies asking about Heidelberg, about Patterson teaching him woodworking terms. The war ended in May of 1945, first in Europe and then in the Pacific a few months later. News of Germany's surrender brought mixed reactions in the camp. Some men wept openly, mourning the defeat of their homeland. Others felt relief that the killing had finally stopped. Friedrich felt both emotions simultaneously, grief and relief tangled together in a knot he couldn't untangle. What came after surrender was uncertainty. Prisoners would be repatriated eventually, but the process would take time. Germany was devastated, occupied by 4 different powers, its infrastructure destroyed, and its government dismantled. Going home meant returning to a country that no longer existed in the form Friedrich had known. The question of what Germany would become hung over everything. In the meantime, life at Camp Gordon continued. Work assignments persisted, now focused on producing goods that would help with post-war reconstruction. Friedrich remained in the woodshop, where he helped build furniture that would be shipped to refugee centers in Europe. The irony of German prisoners making furniture to help displaced persons wasn't lost on him, but the work felt good, productive, a small way of contributing to repair rather than destruction. The repatriation began in early 1946. Prisoners were processed in groups, given documentation and travel instructions, and shipped back across the Atlantic to a Germany none of them fully recognized. When Friedrich's group was called up, he packed his few belongings carefully. At the bottom of his footlocker sat the wooden hygiene kit he'd been issued on his first day at Camp Gordon. The toothbrush was worn now, its bristles frayed from nearly 2 years of regular use. The soap was long gone, replaced several times over. The razor had been sharpened and resharpened until the blade was thin. The toothpaste tube had been squeezed empty months ago. Friedrich held the toothbrush in his hand, studying it like an artifact from another civilization. In a way, it was. This simple object represented a philosophy of human dignity that Friedrich intended to carry home with him. He wrapped it carefully in a piece of cloth and placed it in his pocket. Some of the guards might think it strange to keep such a worn-out thing, but Friedrich didn't care. He needed a reminder. Something tangible to hold on to when memory faded and the past became abstract. The journey back to Europe was subdued. The same ship that had brought American troops to war now carried defeated German soldiers home. Friedrich stood on deck as the ship approached the coast, watching the familiar outline of the continent emerge from morning fog. He felt no joy at returning, only apprehension about what he would find. Germany was worse than he'd imagined. The train from the port to his home region passed through cities that had been reduced to rubble. Frankfurt, Würzburg, Munich. All of them showed scars of aerial bombardment. Entire neighborhoods had been flattened. Survivors picked through ruins, salvaging what they could. Children with hollow eyes begged for food. The scope of destruction was overwhelming. His hometown had survived better than some, being too small and insignificant to merit sustained bombing. But it was still damaged, still struggling. His mother's house had been partially repaired, though it looked shabby and worn. When Friedrich knocked on the door, his mother answered and for a moment didn't recognize him. He had left as a thin, fervent young man. He returned as someone different, heavier in body but carrying a weight in his eyes that had nothing to do with physical mass. His mother embraced him, and they both cried. Later, over weak tea made from who knows what, she asked about his time as a prisoner. Friedrich told her some of it, the basics. He'd been treated well, he said, given adequate food and shelter, allowed to work. She listened with disbelief, having heard stories of prisoner mistreatment in Russian camps. American camps were supposed to be the same, according to what little information had filtered back. They gave us toothbrushes, Friedrich said quietly. On the first day, free toothbrushes and soap and toothpaste. His mother stared at him. Toothbrushes? They cared about our teeth, about our hygiene. They had dentists who fixed cavities. Friedrich pulled the worn toothbrush from his pocket and placed it on the table between them. I kept this. I know it sounds foolish, but I needed to keep it. His mother picked up the toothbrush, turning it over in her hands. She understood what he wasn't saying, that this object represented a fundamental difference in how human life was valued. Tears rolled down her cheeks, and she set the toothbrush down gently. What will you do now? She asked. Friedrich didn't have a clear answer. Germany needed to be rebuilt, that much was obvious. But it needed to be rebuilt differently, on new foundations that rejected the ideology that had led to such catastrophe. Friedrich thought about Sergeant Patterson's words, about war being temporary and enemies becoming something else. He thought about Captain Morris fixing his teeth, about Davies talking about his German grandfather, about the casual equality he'd witnessed in American guards despite the flaws in their society. I'll help rebuild, Friedrich said finally. But rebuild it better. We have to learn from this. We have to remember what happens when we forget basic human dignity. The toothbrush sat on the table, a small wooden object worn by use. Friedrich's mother touched it again, gently, and nodded. She understood. They both understood. The war had taught brutal lessons, but perhaps the most important lesson had come not from the fighting but from captivity, from seeing how an enemy treated those in its power, from the simple act of being handed a toothbrush and being told to keep oneself clean. In the years that followed, Friedrich worked as a carpenter in his hometown, helping to repair damaged buildings and construct new ones. He married a local woman named Anna, who had survived the war by sheer determination. They had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. Friedrich told them stories about the war, edited versions that focused on the lessons rather than the horror. He told them about being a prisoner in America, about the toothbrush and the dental care, and the strange kindness of the enemy. His children grew up in a new Germany, a democratic Germany that rejected its recent past and tried to build something better. They attended schools that taught them about human rights and dignity, that warned them about the dangers of following leaders who promised easy answers to complex problems. Friedrich's oldest son became a teacher, his youngest a doctor, his daughter a social worker. Each of them, in their own way, carried forward the lesson of that toothbrush. Friedrich kept the object for the rest of his life. It sat in a small box on his desk, alongside his military identification tags and a few photographs from before the war. When people asked about it, he told them the story. Some thought he was exaggerating, that surely prisoner treatment couldn't have been that good. But Friedrich insisted it was true, every word. He had the dental fillings to prove it, still intact in his mouth after decades. In 1973, an American scholar researching POW camps in the United States contacted Friedrich after finding his name in camp records. The scholar was writing a book about the treatment of German prisoners and wanted first-hand accounts. Friedrich agreed to be interviewed, and the scholar flew to Germany to meet with him. They sat in Friedrich's living room, the worn toothbrush between them on the coffee table, and Friedrich told his story in full. He talked about the shock of humane treatment, about the cognitive dissonance of being cared for by the enemy, about how that experience had fundamentally changed his understanding of the world. The scholar recorded it all, asking clarifying questions, taking notes. "Do you think the good treatment was manipulation?" the scholar asked. "A calculated move to win hearts and minds?" Friedrich considered this. He'd asked himself the same question many times. "Perhaps partly," he admitted, "but I think it was also genuine. The Americans believed in treating prisoners according to certain standards, not because it was strategically useful, but because it was right. They had rules, and they followed them, even when it would have been easier not to." The scholar nodded. "The Geneva Conventions." "More than that," Friedrich said. "It was a philosophy, a belief that human dignity doesn't disappear because someone is your enemy. We should have understood that." He picked up the toothbrush, holding it carefully. "This object taught me more about civilization than any book or speech. It taught me that a society can be judged by how it treats those in its power, by the small kindnesses it extends even to enemies." The scholar's book was published 2 years later. Friedrich's story was featured prominently, the photograph of him holding the old toothbrush on the back cover. The book became a minor success in academic circles, contributing to a broader understanding of the American POW system during World War II. Friedrich received letters from other former prisoners who had similar experiences, men who remembered the hot showers and dental care and adequate food with the same sense of wonder Friedrich felt. Friedrich died in 1989, just months before the Berlin Wall fell, and Germany began its final reunification. His funeral was attended by family, friends, and several former prisoners he'd stayed in touch with over the decades. On his coffin, his children placed the wooden toothbrush, a symbol of the lesson their father had carried through life. It was buried with him, a small object that had witnessed a profound transformation in how one man understood the world. The story of Friedrich Keller and his toothbrush became part of family legend, passed down to grandchildren and great-grandchildren. They learned about the war through this lens, about how something as simple as basic hygiene care could reveal the fundamental differences between systems of government and philosophies of human worth. The younger generations, growing up in a peaceful, prosperous Germany, sometimes struggled to understand why a toothbrush mattered so much. But Friedrich's children made sure they understood, that they learned the lesson their father had carried from Camp Gordon, Georgia, to his small Bavarian town and kept alive until his final days. In the end, the toothbrush represented hope, not the false hope of propaganda and ideology, but the quiet, stubborn hope that human beings could treat each other with basic decency even in the midst of war. It was a reminder that civilization was not about grand gestures or soaring rhetoric, but about small daily choices to see the humanity in others, to maintain standards of care and dignity, to remember that enemies were still human beings deserving of basic respect. Friedrich's story was one among millions from that terrible war, but it contained a truth that transcended the specific circumstances. The simple act of being handed a toothbrush and being told to keep oneself clean was a statement about what kind of world was worth building, what kind of society was worth fighting for. It was a lesson that remained relevant long after the camps closed and the prisoners went home, a lesson about the power of treating human beings with the dignity they deserved, regardless of the uniform they wore or the flag they once served. The wooden toothbrush, worn and battered, rested beneath Bavarian soil alongside the man who had carried its lesson through decades of peace. But the story lived on, told and retold, a testament to the strange grace that could emerge even from the midst of war's chaos, and to the enduring power of recognizing our shared humanity across all the barriers that divide us.